I don't really know how long to make these, honestly. I don't know what I'm going to do with them. I have to figure it out. So, again, to recap, now, of course, there's nothing in here particularly about the nation land promise that God gives Abraham in a few chapters. But we have to remember that those are the people to whom Moses is first speaking this are those to whom that nation land promise is the most important thing. And that nation, that land, is the basis of their covenant relationship with God. And so this is the setup, the precursor to all of that. And it's talking about how God made this world and dedicated it to himself as his resting place, as his dwelling place, his temple. There are several things in here that are specifically designed to refute the cultural beliefs of the nations around them. Whether it's Egypt, the nation they just left, or the Canaanite nations that they're going into, or the nations, going back to Job. I mentioned him previously. I believe Job was a contemporary of Moses. Job was an Edomite. The Edomites are descendants of Esau. At the time that Moses is leading, of course, the Hebrews are descendants of Jacob, Moses' people. At the time that the Israelites are leaving Egypt and trying to go to their own land, trying to take their own land, the Edomites already have their land. Esau's descendants already have their land. They're living in it. While the Israelites are still wandering around. In fact, they end up encountering Edom on their way through to the land. The Edom, we'll get to that, and Moab and Ammon, who are descendants of Lot, so they were all kinsmen to Israel. And you had the Canaanites themselves, who are in the land to begin with. And so Moses is attempting to refute the creation stories or the beliefs that many of those people around him have. Well, of course, a big one is the fact that there's one God. There isn't a pantheon of gods. There aren't a whole lot of gods. There is one God who made everything and didn't have any help in doing it, didn't have any opposition in doing it either. I talked about this tamine thing, this living creature in the water, living creatures of the sea, these sea monsters. Okay, again, it was a major part. There's a couple things here. First of all, he made all the creatures in the sea, even the scary ones. And secondly, it was a major part of many of the cultural beliefs around Israel that God fought and defeated a sea monster, Leviathan or Rahab or whatever they call it, when he made the world and made the world out of the corpse of this God. That was a common cultural belief. In fact, we're even going to hear that mentioned. The psalm, a couple of the Psalms even kind of draws that to the attention, the idea of God fighting Leviathan. God himself will talk about Leviathan at the end of Job. So that was a common cultural concept around them, and this is designed to refute that, saying that God, all these sea creatures, even the scary ones with the big tentacles that come out and sometimes grab us, our ships, or the big teeth ones, the big sharks out there, even the scary ones were made by God, and they're under his control. And there is no opposing force that God had to fight in order to make creation out of. There's also no female God. It's very common, and God didn't have a partner in making all of this stuff. It's very common in the ancient Near East. We call this region of the world the ancient Near East, A&E. It's very common in the myths of the ancient Near East for the world to have existed because a male god and a female goddess got together and had sex, copulated, and produced it. It was either through the god's semen or somehow their act of copulation resulted in the world physically coming to be. And that's refuted here too. There is no partner with God. God speaks it. It happens. There is no act of copulation with the lady god that creates the world through some physical act. In fact, if anything, it kind of refutes the idea, period, that this is kind of one of the things about it that annoys me, is that we want so badly to turn this text into a technical manual for how God physically made creation, when part of the existence, part of the purpose of this passage is to deny the physical necessity of God making the world. What I mean by that was kind of a clumsy way of saying it, but like I said, Moses, when he's writing these texts in the 1440s BC, is not thinking of our modern day scientific understanding of the universe. He's thinking of the people who were in his camp out there, the million or so, or however many there were, people in their camp that have proven repeatedly they have a hard time following this God, and trying to prove to them why they should and not follow these other gods around them. And he's writing this story to refute, he's writing this creation account to refute the creation myths of the cultures around them that he knows that these people around him are going to have trouble resisting. They're going to be tempted to succumb to the cultures around them and be like them and worshiping the various parts of the physical creation. So to a certain degree, Moses is explicitly denying us the knowledge of how God physically made the world. He didn't make it out of the body of a dead God. He didn't make it out of any pre-existing matter, according to Moses. He just spoke it, and it happened. He speaks, and things happen. And that is Moses' point. So to try to turn that into a scientific text, explaining how the world physically came to be, is somewhat at odds with why Moses wrote this passage to begin with. Talking about lights, the sun, the moon, the stars. This was a big deal to the ancient people. There is nothing more important in their lives than the sun. Okay, and everyone in the ancient world, and then many of us even to this day, we don't necessarily worship the sun these days, but everybody in the ancient world not just worship the sun, but oriented their lives around the sun. They would talk about directions in terms of which way the sun was. Like if it was, the sun came up in the east, so the east is the most important direction. And they would talk about directions in terms of which way they were standing in relation to the sun. So if you're standing and facing the eastern sky, because that's where the sun came from, well, to your left then would be the north. So the north is now the left direction, the south is to the right, and the west is to your back. And they followed the stars. It specifically says here in the account of the creation of the sun, moon, and stars that they were meant to mark seasons and days and years. It says that in Genesis 1:14. They separate the day and the night and serve as signs to mark seasons, days, and years. Those two things get said before the idea of them showing light on the earth. So the idea here is that they mark time. And ancient cultures oriented their calendars around these. We still do to this day. We orient our calendar around the sun. Ancient cultures oriented their calendars around the stars or the moon. And so we mark time, and of course, we mark time by the days and the nights based on when the sun rises or sets. The entire Egyptian way of life, which these people would have been familiar with because they came out of Egypt, they had lived there their entire lives until Moses took them out. The entire Egyptian way of life was based on the circle the sun makes around the earth and the cycle of the flood seasons of the Nile. When the Nile rose, it would flood the land every year, starting in the summer. In fact, they dated their calendar around the day the flood season started, inundation, which would be our July. I think it was July 20th in our calendar. This flood, the river would rise, Nile would rise for a few months, and it would recede, and it would leave behind this silt on the ground, which they would then use to fertilize their fields and grow their next crop. And that happened every single year. And so over the course of time, this constant rising and falling of the Nile got tied into their religious belief in the cycle of death and rebirth, which they symbolize in the sun going across the sky, riding its chariot across the sky. The sun god Ra rode his chariot across the sky every day, and then at night he went under the earth and was in the underworld, and he had to fight his way to the underworld so he could come back out and be in the sky again. So God here is, so to the Egyptians and to every other ancient culture, like the sun was the most important thing. It was the God, their God of gods. And Here we're clearly labeling this. We're not even using the Hebrew word for sun. Where here in English they don't have the word sun, it's just light. So it's clearly marking the sun as being inferior to God. The sun is just an object that God made, something He did, something He made for a specific purpose, did something specific with, and it is not a being that's worthy of worship in its own right. Another major aspect of this is to prove that human beings have great value and worth in God's sight. It was very common again in the now again when I say this very common thing, you have to realize there were, in this region of the world at this point in time, there were lots of little nations and even little city-states scattered here. Egypt was a powerful nation, but you have the Edomites, I mentioned them earlier, the Moabites, the Ammonites, and all the Canaanite city-states. And they all had their own little versions of some of this stuff. There was a lot of overlap, okay? But everywhere you went, you'd have these little versions. Like one name we're going to be hearing a lot in pages to come is Baal, or Baal, however you pronounce it, B-A-A-L, B-A-A-L. And Baal was one of the chief gods of just about every pantheon. It's one of the ones that's going to cause trouble for Israel later on. But every area had like its own version of Baal or Baal. Like they would be the storm god, the god of fertility, sometimes, whatever, El Baal, or, well, that was a clumsy way of saying it, but like every area you go to would have like its own little version of Baal or Baal. So it was very common. So there was a lot of overlap between all these beliefs, with every area, every territory, every tribe, every city had like their own little spins on it. And so here, God is being portrayed as the God of gods. There is no other God. All these other things that these people make different gods out of are just things that the real God has made. The sea creatures, He made them. The sun, the moon, He made them. It's like we orient our time around the sun, moon, and stars. We orient our calendars around the sun, moon, and stars. God made them for us to tell time with. He made them to give us light. But like I said, He also made the earth for us to live in and be fruitful over, and be masters of, to reproduce in and be masters of. It's very common, this is a point I was making a moment ago, it's very common in that day and time and in that culture and those cultures around them that mankind was made basically to be the God's slaves. They were just, the gods didn't want to do the hard work of actually tending the earth, so the gods made mankind to do that for them, basically, because they didn't want to. You have to remember, again, life is difficult for these people at this point in time. All right, I'm sitting here in this nice climate-controlled apartment. I've got a fan blowing on my head. I've got this camera right in front of me, connected to this fancy computer, which I use every day. I have these cats sitting around here. I got a cat over there sitting in my TV stand, right in front of my TV. I've got a kitchen right beyond there. I'm going to go actually eat. I haven't had supper yet. It's 8:20 in the evening. Need to go have supper. We live in a very cushy, climate-controlled environment. We're talking about climate change and all that, but it's like our lives are pretty darn comfortable, okay? Even in some of the harsher regions of the world today, our lives are more comfortable than they would have been 3,500 years ago. And I haven't personally gone to live in Africa, deepest Arctic Africa, or whatever you want to view as your stereotypical most horrible place on earth. It's like, you go back 3,500 years in time, and life was difficult for these people. They were an agricultural-based society, and they had to do that work, and they had to do it by hand. It was hard, and it was rough. Building houses was rough, okay? They lived in these mud brick houses. It was rough. They lived in a desert. The environment around them was rough. They were wilderness. Moses went to go tend sheep for 40 years in the wilderness, okay? The life was difficult for these people. And so it's very common in this region of the world at this point in time to find cultures that have the idea that mankind was just made to do all the hard work the gods didn't want to do. There's no real concept of sin in the other cultures around Israel at the time. We're going to get into that when we get into the next couple of chapters, which I'm not going to do tonight, by the way. The idea that it was made to be perfect. It was made to be nourishing and replenishing, and the work that man was put in he was put in the garden to do work. He definitely was. But the work the man and woman were originally made to do was not going to be difficult, and it was not going to be hard. Okay, it was going to be rewarding, it was going to be satisfying, and the creation was going to work with us. Now it's fighting us. Okay, we'll read that when we get to that in a couple of chapters. But the contrast here is that compared to the rest of the creation myths around them, the Israel, everybody else was saying that the gods at the time just didn't want to bother the hard work themselves, so they made man to do that hard work for them. And it's very consistent. It's very easy. I mean, you don't even have to be a psychologist or have a degree in psychoanalysis or anything like that to realize that when mankind as a species makes up gods, he always makes them in his image. We read here specifically that God made us in his image. And when we make gods, we always make them in our image. When the people of the ancient Near East make gods, they make them in their image. When the people of Europe made their gods, they made them in their image. When the people of the Far East made their gods, they made them in their image. When the people of Africa make their gods, they make them in their image. Okay, when the people of the Philippines and the southeastern islands, southeastern Pacific make their gods, they make them in their image. You can always tell, you can always see where if you read mythology and you study, which I've done, I haven't done it in a while, but I have read books and I've been focusing pretty much exclusively on the ancient Near Eastern cultures around the Bible for the last 5 or 6 years now. But in years past, I did read books about mythology of other cultures more worldwide. And it's clear to see like where each culture, how each culture forms its own mythologies. It's always based on what they see, what's around them. Like what is in, you're going to see a lot of gods tailored to each specific region and what each group of people are like. Okay, because when we make gods, we make them in our image. Even today, in our humanistic society today, we don't believe in God anymore. We don't believe in gods, but we're still making gods in our own image. You know, we're still bowing down in an altar of some kind or another. You know, I think it's very accurate to say that over the course of the last 40 or 50 years, there have been a lot of right-wing evangelicals which have made up God in their image in the form of money. And I think it's also very safe to say that today we're currently beset by a left-wing culture that, of course, completely ignores God, but makes up its own God in the form of these moral purity tests they make everybody take. And failed, of course, because nobody can actually pass these moral purity tests. So whenever man makes up God, he always makes it in his own image. Oh, great. Well, in the end, God could have chosen any people group on earth to be the people he chose to bring his son to the world through. He chose the Israelites, he chose Abraham and his descendants after him to do that with. Now, I believe there are geographical things. You know, Israel is pretty much right at the center of the planet. From Israel, you can walk to just about everywhere on the planet if you really wanted to. And I believe that there were logistical, geographical reasons why God chose that specific spot in the world to start his message from, because it was easier than to spread it out to the rest of the world from there. But in the end, he could have chosen any group of people, and it would have largely been the same. The difference would have been just a geographical slant to their. You know, we have a lot of figures of speech and a lot of phrases and a lot of cultural context in this book that comes specifically from Israel being where it is on the eastern side of the Mediterranean, right sandwiched between that and a desert, and serving as a sort of land bridge between north and south. And that's going to play a factor into the culture of the Israelites, into the way the Bible was written. In the end, God could have chosen any group of people from anywhere on earth to spread his message through. And the message would have been, I mean, the goal of the message would have been the same. It's just the figures of speech would have changed. And even with those figures of speech, you know, it's getting a little bit late here. And I'm not going to do this for every video that I do. We're not going to get this in depth with every chapter in the Bible, trust me. But there are some figures of speech here that we do need to focus on and point out, because and again, like I said earlier, I'm not going to do this for every chapter. I'm not going to do this in general. But to understand Genesis, you do need to understand some of the words that are used in Genesis, Genesis 1, that is, in particular, in order to understand more culturally correctly what Moses is actually trying to say to the people who are first hearing him. it's getting kind of late. I've been doing this for a while now. We could go from the very beginning, literally the very beginning, in the beginning, Bereshit, or how you pronounce it in Hebrew. I'm not going to start there tonight, though. You know, the first three words in the Hebrew Bible, I believe, are Bereshit, Bara, Elohim, or something like that. You know, in the beginning, created God, or whatever. Their word order isn't as specific as ours is in English. And there is a little bit of a difference between what it actually says in Hebrew and how English versions render it. But the first, I'll get to that next time. The first words I'm going to focus on today are in verse 2, which is where it says formless and empty. In the Hebrew, those words are tohu and bohu, or well, whatever and is. Tohu, but formless, empty, tohu, bohu. It's a word pair. Tohu appears on its own, but bohu never appears in the Hebrew Bible on its own. Only ever appears with tohu, and only appears like 3 times. And one in here, obviously, one in Jeremiah, and one in Isaiah. And in each of those times, the meaning basically calls back to here in Genesis 1. And so tohu and bohu as a pair go together. And it basically communicates the idea. Here, you get the idea here that it's referring to the physical state of the earth, formless and empty, and the Spirit of God is hovering over the waters. First of all, where'd the water come from? Did God make the water to begin with? There's water somewhere involved in all this. Peter's even going to say in his epistles that the world was made through water. So there was water to begin with at the beginning of all this. We don't even get to the story of how God created that. By the way, another thing to talk about when it comes to not literalizing Genesis 1. Did you know there's actually 2, actually possibly more than 2, but there's another account of creation in the Old Testament, and it's in Proverbs, where we basically find out that wisdom was with God when he created the world. Well, this says nothing about wisdom at all. So later on, several hundred years later, Solomon is going to come along and add his own spin to the creation of the world. So we know from that alone that this is not an all-encompassing, completely inclusive account of how God made creation. Because this says nothing about wisdom, even though, according to Solomon, wisdom was preeminent throughout the works of creation. So right there we know that this is not complete as an account of how God actually made the world. But when we read it here as the earth is formless and empty, it gets across the idea of its shape or its form. Formless, literally formless and empty. But it actually doesn't really mean that. It actually has more of a sense of purpose. It was functionless. It was formless and functionless. It was a wasteland. Remember, these are people who were familiar with wasteland. These are people who were familiar with Moses had lived 40 years in the wilderness. The Israelites wandered 40 years in the wilderness. Okay, they were familiar with the idea of wilderness and wasteland and territories that were not good for anything. Okay, they prized useful land. There's so much of an emphasis on land, and it's not just land. It's literally like that land, that ground, that patch of ground. We're going to get to that when we get to the actual nation covenant promise, land covenant promise. But like, there's a huge emphasis literally on the ground, the good ground that you can grow crops out of. Because these people would have been surrounded on all sides by desert ground that you can't do anything with. Or mountainous ground. You know, harsh, dry, arid, mountainous regions. Okay, so tohu and bohu connotes the idea to them of formless, functionless, and purposeless. Not necessarily speaking about the physical shape of the earth, but about its condition. It could not be used for anything. It was not good for anything. It needed to be worked into a useful, functional shape. So God's act of creation is not designed so much about bringing matter into being. Now, he did that, obviously, at some point. The exact mechanics of how he did that are not mentioned, are not discussed. In fact, as I mentioned earlier, they're purposely not discussed. Other creation accounts from Moses' day talked about that. Okay, the gods waged a war against evil gods and killed them and built the world out of their dead bodies, or he had sex with his wife and made the world out of that. You know, she gave birth to the world or something, or whatever, or it came out of his semen. Sometimes it just comes out of the male god's semen and just becomes the world. Okay, like this God doesn't do any of that. He just speaks and it happens. The exact process of how he gathers all the atoms in the universe together and distributes them is not mentioned. Okay, and the formless and empty of Genesis 1:2 does not necessarily refer to the physical shape of the world as much as it refers to its purpose, its function, what it's supposed to do. In Genesis 1:2, The earth was not good for anything, not useful, not functional, cannot be used in that state. God then has to work it into a useful function, to a useful state, so they can function. And at the end, when it says God sees everything, that it is very good, it means the creation is functioning as intended. It's working as it should. So that is one of the words we're going to focus on. Well, two of the words technically. One of the things we're going to focus on when I get into. Now again, I'm not going to do this for every video, but I'm going to do it for this one. So next time, we're going to look more deeply into some of the other specific words in the Hebrew account of Genesis 1 to help us get a little bit better understanding of what Moses was saying to the people who were hearing him for the first time.